Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Before we get started on our last notes discussion of the year, we have a special pre-recorded surprise announcement that we would like to share with the community.
Welcome to the Grid's final 2020 edition of Notes, Art and Tech Encounters. I'm here with my French and German colleagues from Unique Silicon Valley, also founding members of the Grid Art Powers Technology. And today we're here for a couple of opening remarks and also very significantly passing the baton of our Unique Silicon Valley presidency to Juliette and Noemi for 2021. So we're looking back on quite an eventful couple of years. So we founded Unique Silicon Valley in June of 2019, and shortly thereafter we got funding for the Grid, and then we did lots of stuff, and in 2021 everything clearly got canceled, but we regrouped and launched a new festival format in San Francisco with all of our local partners and a gazillion partners in Europe and on the East Coast. So that was a blast. And I'm here now to basically hand it over to them and say thank you to all of our partners and everyone involved for a fantastic 2 years. I was very, very glad to be your pilot, so to speak. And I couldn't think of anyone better to take over the presidency from now on than my dear colleague Juliette Donadieu, who joins us from the French Embassy into the United States, but also founder of the Villa San Francisco, and Noemi Nyangido, who's the director of the Goethe Institute in San Francisco. So handing over to you, ladies.
Thank you, Clara. It's a real pleasure. I think I'd like to start first by, say a huge thank you to you and Martin for the, this amazing presidency. And we are delighted with Noemi and, to have France and Germany coming together, joining forces to continue the Grid and to keep the same energy. And I think we keep the same mission, is to continue this dialogue between the arts and tech communities and to really envision different formats to have this dialogue. We could have continue the festival, reports, event, conferences, even residencies program. Let's imagine many things in 2021.
Hooray!
Yes. And Noemi, please.
Thank you, Juliette. Thank you, Clara. Like you said, Juliette, we're looking forward so much to take over the baton and lead it into the next year, this amazing cluster. And we are so grateful for all the work that has been done, the network that was established, and the dialogues we have started with our amazing friends and partners, both here in the US, but also beyond in Europe. And for those of you who have joined us for the festival or some of our notes editions, you probably experienced how amazing and exciting it is to bring together these different perspectives from Europe and the US on certain issues all around art and technology. And when we look into the upcoming year, we particularly would like to focus on these basically the crisis that we've all gone through this year, some of us more than others, I have to say. And I'm talking of COVID, but I'm also talking of injustices, social and racial. And we really want to take a step back and see, listen and learn and try to become more inclusive, look into new and different perspectives, give a platform for voices that are maybe not have been heard so far, and start and continue this kind of dialogue. And we very much look forward to see you all next year again in 2021.
This is how you get in touch. Get on thegrid.org and don't miss out on this coming edition of Notes, where we'll discuss the findings of our principal investigator, Vanessa Chang, sharing with you all how to improve our art and technology network and how to be a more resilient community with all the challenges ahead. So stay tuned. And with that, we pass on to our curator and moderator, Marnie. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much, Noemi, Juliette, and Claire, for that exciting announcement. And congratulations to Noemi and Juliette. My name is Marnie Benny, and I'm an independent curator focused on the juncture of science and technology. And I'll be your host for the last panel discussion of nodes for 2020. Can you believe this year is almost over? And what a year it's been. I'm sure I don't just speak for myself, that we are all ready for a new year to come. So we're really excited about this Nodes edition. As was mentioned before, we have Vanessa Chang, the GRID's principal investigator, who will be sharing the research she spent the last year cultivating for the GRID's 2020 Art and Tech Report. We will cover topics including the entwined history of technology, art, and counterculture in the Bay Area, and we will look to its future, exploring how building regenerative art and tech networks could be a solution to the pitfalls that these partnerships face. So let's get started. First, I will briefly introduce the panelists, and then Joel and Vanessa will share a little bit about themselves and their work, and Vanessa will share most extensively about her report that she's taken the last year to craft. Then we will have our discussion. In the last 10 minutes, we'll have questions and answers. And feel free to answer questions to ask questions during the event, and you can find that in the questions and answer section in Zoom in the bottom menu bar. So first, I'll introduce Clara Bloom. She is head of Open Austria's Art and Tech Lab. She's president of the Unicluster Silicon Valley and founder of the GRID. And Clara, do you want to say a couple words about yourself?
Cool, thank you. That basically sums it up, but thank you, Marnie. Yeah, so I was there right at the beginning, sitting together with my EU colleagues and a couple of local partners, brainstorming over several months, following up on an extensive, basically Q&A session that we had with local institutions and thought leaders on how to best position us as a European cluster in Silicon Valley. And therefore, the GRID came up as an idea on one foggy afternoon in June. And basically during the last 2 years, my co-pilot Martin and I forged this alliance very intensely during our presidency and launched a new festival format in the times of Corona, which I also curated together with Vanessa. So it's been an exciting ride, and I'm even more excited to see what's coming next.
Great, thank you so much. And to introduce Joel Slayton is a pioneering artist, educator, and curator. Joel is professor emeritus at the San Jose State, where he founded the Cadre Laboratory for New Media in 1984. He is currently collaborating with researcher Lisa Johansson on the Lng Ranch, which is a long-term initiative focused on land use and sense of place. Previously, Joel served as executive director of 01, the Silicon Valley-based arts organization, an agency that produced 4 international art biennials and featured more than 600 artists from 45 countries. And perhaps the lady of the hour, morning or evening, depending on where you're tuning in from, we have Vanessa Chang. As a curator, writer, and researcher and educator, Vanessa builds conversations and communities about art, technology, and human bodies. She is senior program manager at Leonardo, and she holds a PhD in modern thought and literature from Stanford University and teaches in the Visual Critical Studies program at the California College of the Arts. And most recently, she curated the GRID Exposure Art plus Tech and Policy Days, and also recoding Cryptech at SOMA's Cultural Center, and Codeme's Art and Tech Festivals both in 2018 and 2019. So without further ado, Vanessa, I'm gonna hand it off to you so you can share your findings of your report with us.
Thank you, Marnie. It's been an interesting journey doing this report, and I'm eager to share at least some broad strokes about it. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So over the last 6 months, I've been interviewing people from the art and technology ecosystem in the Bay Area. While the last few years has seen a surge of international interest in practices in the intersection of art and technology from more traditional art, academic, and governmental institutions, a lot of this work is rooted in the Bay Area and greater Silicon Valley. With that in mind, I've been interviewing people from tech companies, museums and art collectives, municipal agencies, foundations, and think tanks, colleges and universities, as well as other entities working at the art and tech intersection farther afield, nationally as well as internationally. I asked them to give me some insight into how their different organizations might understand their place in this ecosystem, its health, what they understand to be the most urgent concerns in art and technology practice, who they see as their significant partners, and with what and with whom they hope to build the future of this space. So what I found is people who are really invested and committed to this work, and that their evolution reflects larger historical shifts in the tech industry, and that there's a longer entwinement between culture, particularly counterculture, and the technology industry. But the counterculture and this culture writ large is really struggling with long-term sustainability. So it's a hefty report, and today we don't have a lot of time, so I just want to highlight in broad strokes a few related observations from my report and how I think the grid might contribute to being in this space. So first of all, I wanted to highlight that art and technology practitioners are often on the margins. So they straddle and cross disciplines, sectors, and audiences. They're often an ill fit for existing institutions, existing kind of disciplinary definitions. And because of that, they are building ad hoc networks to find the resources, audiences, and education to support their practices. So it's interesting because a lot of artists in the space are already innovating in tech research and development to support their artistic vision on new platforms. They really test and probe the limits of a product in service of cultural expression, and the relationships are there, but they really need support and fortification. So in part, this is because funding from traditional sources like foundations and also tech funding, despite expectations to the contrary, it's not so readily available to these artists or to these art organizations. And because there's this moment right now where there's so much interest in this field, I mean, there's been several international exhibitions in art and technologies, even just AI art, the Barbican, and so on. There's another one called Uncanny Valley at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco. And the National Endowment for the Arts has been conducting its own, I think, year and a half long study into this space. So because this moment is really, there's a lot of interest and it dovetails with a larger interest in tech regulation, it's an important moment to really fortify these networks, build bridges, kind of really diagnose what's happening. It's disconnected. I mean, the networks are robust, but people are constantly kind of having to reinvent them. And this is where I think the grid might really be able to help. So zooming into the Bay Area a little bit, I found that the dynamics of art and technology practice in the Bay Area tend to be dominated by industry interests, what are called hype cycles. So a lot of the innovations, and this is something that you can think about in terms of broader art and technology practice, are linked to technological hype cycles. So a surge of interest in 3D printing, and so a lot of investment and a lot of artists working in that space. And then VR, which I mean, I think this was the fourth hype cycle for VR most recently, about 5 years ago. Recently AI, as we're all pretty familiar with. And so the demands of the marketplace tend to really inform the funding and the interest in this kind of work. And it makes it very hard for artists and art organizations to have a sustainable practice and have sustainable institutions. What the perspective shared with me by artists in this field and also people in kind of academic spaces is that there is ultimately an asymmetry of power in this ecosystem in the Bay Area because companies tend to design the technologies and accumulate much of the capital around this work. And so one of the terms that came up a lot was this notion of extraction, that this is really kind of an economics of extraction that artists are being kind of extracted from, and that the cultural capital and the cultural resources that they have are not being supported in ways that are sustainable. So one of my favorite quotes from these interviews that I did was that describing the innovation ecosystem in the Bay Area, but perhaps also nationally, that it's a political landscape that's pockmarked. It's kind of like a mashup of the moon and the rainforest. There's places of lush, verdant opportunity and barren landscapes of pockmarked asteroid collisions where ideas around innovation were spawned and destroyed by meteor strike. So I loved this image so much that this is from Craig Hobbs, who's a professor who runs the CADRE Media Lab at San Jose State, because it really gives this sense of incredibly generative innovation in this space, but also profound disconnection between actors and discontinuity as well. What's interesting, I felt, is that this asymmetry doesn't actually represent the longer entwinement of counterculture and technology in the Bay Area. So the Bay Area, another finding I want to highlight, is the Bay Area counterculture, particularly in the Cold War era, as well as the art and technology collaborations of the same era. So I'm thinking here about LACMA's Art and Tech Lab, MIT's CABS, and other kinds of labs and collaborations that continue to shape and are really kind of being invoked in right now to design art and tech collaborations, really informed the emergence of big tech. So there's this longer entwinement of the counterculture post-World War II and throughout the Cold War, grounded particularly in the values of techno-utopianism, right? So this is where you can find a really fascinating connection between the counterculture and what one scholar calls the new communalists. And so here you can track a history through Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth Catalog, Wired magazine, and the values of kind of flattened hierarchies, interdisciplinarity, and collaboration that are continue to be valorized by the industry. So I'm really interested in tracking, in this report, tracking that history and thinking about how culture and technology in the Bay Area have been extracted, have been separated, even though there is a longer history there, and they really have informed each other in generative ways. And what I would like to suggest is that there needs to be more regenerative approaches to them. Finally, based on these interviews and this notion of extraction, I think about extraction's opposite, right? When we think about economies, regeneration. So, and thinking about what kind of contribution the grid can make as a national and international network, I really sought to think about what it means to really build a regenerative ecosystem with meaningful partnerships between these really disparate actors. How do you build a connection, a meaningful partnership between someone working in a corporate art and technology lab, which have been fairly critiqued for ultimately kind of reproducing neoliberal priorities of capital, and other nonprofit models of residencies or other kinds of actors, without dissolving their identities and that affirm the priorities and strengths of each partner. So that's kind of the direction that I take the report in. What are some strategies for developing a shared language based on practice? So here I spoke to some of the more exciting and interesting collaborations and research collaborations in corporate and nonprofit and academic environments, and how they stage that encounter between artists and technologists, as well as staging that partnership between individuals as well as institutions. So all of these conversations really highlight a need to fortify that network in a way that's regenerative, that's sustainable. They highlight that this is the moment to do that because of this recent interest, and because also of this recent interest in tech regulation. There's an opportunity for artists to really intervene here. And so what I would like to suggest, in segueing into this larger conversation that we're having, is that we need to really find a way to develop a shared language that isn't entirely orchestrated by the industry, or that isn't entirely orchestrated by the demands of capital. So I'd like to leave with a quote by one of the artists and scientists I interviewed, who's Wei Dong Yang, who's the co-founder of Kinetech Arts. And he says, art is about inventing the measure, not applying the measure. And so I find this really evocative because it really suggests how artists can come to the table, and in a real genuine collaboration, we can kind of find a way to redefine the language and the practice around which we stage these encounters between individuals, but also institutions. So I shall stop there. There's plenty more to say, but I'd love to do so in conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa. That is fascinating. And I can't wait for us to dig in and start talking about it. But before we do that, Joel, if you would like to share a little bit about the work that you do, kind of being an example of a mover and a shaker in the Bay Area, that would be great.
Good morning, everyone. Mover and shaker, I don't know so much, perhaps. Well, first off, let me just say, I hope everybody's doing all right and during these times. It's been really tough. And so I applaud all the work that GRID has been doing. I think it's essential, and hopefully we come out the other side of this more informed than we went in. I'm a curator, an artist with about 40 plus years of experience in this so-called field of art and technology. I'm also a professor emeritus at the Cadre Laboratory in San Jose State University, where I founded that program in 1984. I live and work in Silicon Valley, a global epicenter of the creative economy. And for me, that's a very important commitment because of the social, political, and economic culture that it represents, and that provides both a platform but also a context for my work, both organizationally but also personally as an artist. You know, over the years, I've had the opportunity to collaborate with a really wide range of tech companies and cultural institutions and academic research centers, resulting in hundreds of exhibitions and presentations around the globe. Something I'm very proud of, but would only have been possible had I been part of the evolution of this field as it unfolded here in the Bay Area. My practice has evolved to focus on the speculative nature of technological innovation, and is often realized in elaborate production systems that are in and of themselves artworks, in addition to the outcomes that they produce. These include a wide range of media technologies, from visualization technologies to robotics, telepresence, AI, and networks, and so forth. I come from more of a conceptual art orientation than I do a technological orientation or science orientation, although both of those things are of deep interest to me. You know, one of my recent projects is something called Citizen Sticks, which is focused on creating a audience expression platform for visualizing and sharing of public opinion. And so it basically puts people in a room and gives them sticks with little lights on the end of it, which they can control, which are monitored by image processing technology to allow them to express in real time their response to what they're being presented or hearing. And that collective response is analyzed in real time and represented to the audience to inform it as to the direction and unfolding of the conversation. And it creates a kind of equalization of participation for both audience and presenters. I'm also working on a project called Post-Pandemic Provocations with Roger Molina and Nina Sigleti from Toronto. Roger, of course, is executive director over at Leonardo, where I also sit on the board. This project grew out of a recognition that rather than just simply being reactionary to the COVID crisis, there was an opportunity here to begin to rethink everything and to take a moment to step back with what we refer to as slow emergence, taking our time to begin to rethink the uncertainties that the pandemic has thrown upon us, and to really begin to develop new ways of moving forward. I transitioned here to the Bay Area from MIT, where I was involved with a laboratory there called the Visible Language Workshop, which was one of the precursor labs to the MIT Media Lab. And that was in 1981. And I was really fortunate to be early in the game in the Bay Area and was able to create a number of opportunities working with tech industry here, where I came with the ambition of infiltrating the industry and was successful in the sense of convincing them that as an artist, I was able to do things that the researchers in their labs were not doing. And it was a really rich 3 or 4 years of engagement as I sort of popped from one to the next. And then the opportunity with the Cadre Laboratory arose because Cadre was actually established as the first national conference on art and technology. And it brought together a huge number of people here in the Bay Area, but also nationally, to begin this dialogue. Out of that grew a commitment from the university to establish a permanent laboratory that would focus on computing in the arts. And that was, pre-personal computers. And we began with the premise that every artist needed to learn how to code, and every artist needed to be able to have the technical skills to really further their own interest in a deep way as it related to information technologies. Cadre now, under the direction of Craig Hobbs, who you mentioned earlier, has grown to be one of the largest majors at the university. I think they have over 400 undergraduate students studying digital media. That tells you something about the evolution of the field and also something about Silicon Valley and its value as it sees, or what the digital media degree represents in terms of a value proposition to the industry. MFA graduate students from Cadre have populated universities around the world in terms of establishing and leading their own programs. And around 2008 or so, I started a company called C5 Corporation. And C5 was a hybrid company that was a consortium of artists that came together to basically sit in the sweet spot between doing research, art, and business, and being comfortable with being both in the boardroom, but also being comfortable in the museum. It focused on big data, visualization, navigation systems, and location media. Around 2008 or so, I also stepped into the role as executive director of 01. 01 hosted 4 international biennials of art and technology. We commissioned nearly 600 artists from 44 countries around the world for showcasing at the festival, and that includes both, installations, but also large outdoors scaled public artworks and a variety of other incarnations. 01, however, also established under my direction a fellowship program which placed artists with tech industry for year-long programs where they were innovation challenge driven, and the artists would work in concert with those industries on a variety of projects. They were not always located in the obvious places within the industry, and it might be something we can talk about a little bit later. The current project I'm working on is the Lng Ranch. This is a project with my partner, Lisa Johansson, who's a research scientist. And we just completed an 11,000-mile, 15-destination tour of the northern tier states of America, visiting towns and locations where land use issues were paramount, doing interviews and documentation. We're in the process of producing something called the Antenna Project, which is a live narrowcast radio show program that will take place out of our Airstream trailer as we continue our journey here in the next few years. So that gives you a basic idea of my background. And so hopefully I'll be able to add something to this conversation as we move forward. So thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you will have much to add to this conversation. So, what's so great about these panels is that we can have so many different perspectives. And I really think that we have that, we have academic, we have government, we have nonprofit. And Vanessa, you were talking about in your report, the importance of holistic work, basically approaching problems holistically and creating these spaces where stakeholders are identified, and that it having to be sort of a healthy ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if everyone could sort of give their perspective on kind of who are the stakeholders that sort of need to be a part of this in Silicon Valley, and how do we best identify their goals and needs, and sort of all work, have it kind of like come together to understand them and then work with them. It's kind of a big question, but hopefully. So whoever wants to go. Claire, yeah.
Can I jump in here, since we were the ones commissioning the report, and that was exactly very well summarized, the idea behind it, and also basically Vanessa's task to identify those stakeholders, which she has done an exceptional job at doing, also building on the Art and Tech report that we commissioned in 2019, co-authored by Nadav Hochman and Alex Rabin, who also did an exceptional job in, first of all, identifying the major players. And I think Vanessa has contributed by adding perhaps even an even broader vision on who are the players that we need to include in this conversation. So I think what we parted on with the grid was this holistic vision. Why clearly we're working in this triangular vision on art, tech, and policy. As diplomats, our mission is complementary to art and technology. Actors in the Bay Area, we can contribute something that clearly art and technology organizations that are looking here can't, and therefore there is a lot of potential in this, say, alliance. And building upon that, clearly it was very easy to find partners for the grid because of this additional layer of getting funding, clearly being funded by the European Commission and the private sector here in Silicon Valley. So that was an absolute first in the history of art and tech in Silicon Valley, that convergence of different interests, always also altogether pulling on the same string. So the holistic vision is clearly triggered by a conversation that we've had over the last, say, 10 years now, but which have been has become imperative to all of us to tackle it. The conversation of the techlash and how to tackle it. And since we operate in the field of tech diplomacy, and regulation is near and dear to us, but only a fractured vision of how to approach, say, the current crisis of technology's impact on our everyday life. We see that clearly the position, say, our vision of a correct bottom-up approach would be through the arts. And therefore, we commissioned a report to identify the players, and clearly all of our stakeholders involved are already acting in this space. So 01, as Joel has pointed out, is one of the legacy institutions that has pioneered most of this work already. And clearly there are hype cycles, and 01 is now much more active in public diplomacy, actually throughout the world. But the grid is now here to perhaps fill a void where it is needed to engage in a conversation that lets the tech industry know that there are government actors who are interested in this conversation, perhaps through a different angle, not just regulating from top down, but just creating a critical mass of voices that need to be included in the design and also the conception of new technologies.
Yeah, I would add too that one thing that I really that I found in talking to people is that they felt there was a need as well in the United States for more infrastructure to support this work. And maybe Joel can speak to this, but a lot of people working in this space might feel if they might be in an academic institution, because that's a way of sustaining, their lives as well as this work. It's very hard to really easily find the support, financial resources, education, and otherwise for this kind of work. So there's a real need to build that infrastructure in a way that I think serves artists more. There's I had an interesting conversation with Ben Vickers, who is the CTO of Serpentine Galleries, and they just released this report, Future Art Ecosystems, which is really about trying to participate in a conversation about defining what that ecosystem looks like. And he said, look, I mean, it's better to articulate it from an institutional perspective rather than have it be defined by an ad hoc funding regime 20 years out. Because as I was saying, like so much of this field seems to be buffeted by the kind of tumult of capital, where the money is, hype cycles. So what can we do to support artists in this space when they don't fit very easily into existing kind of disciplinary spaces, even though, I mean, academic institutions do kind of support that work. Places like the Cadre Media Lab certainly do. So I'd see that as really kind of foundational to sustaining this work. If it is to inform policy discussions, if it is to inform technological development, then sustaining artists and their lives and their creative practices, I think, has to be really central to it.
So may I add here? I think it's important to recognize that, and I'm sure everyone does, but because it's somewhat of an obvious thing I'm about to say, which is that there is no single ecosystem to Silicon Valley. Mm-hmm. There are multiple ecosystems at play, sometimes in concert with one another, sometimes in conflict with one another. And all of them are evolutionary, all of them are adaptive, all of them are dynamic. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for any particular stakeholder or any individual artist, for that matter. And so it's a complicated question to assess, well, where is the tech support for the arts? It's almost a misnomer in terms of the real questions involved. And from my own perspective, and we had talked about this a bit in my interview, which was, this idea of what are the artists bringing to the table that is the value. The recognition of the value proposition, and I sort of made a distinction. I tried to make a distinction between, the overall need for creativity in all of those ecosystems that is really important, and I think everyone recognized creativity as a factor of innovation and problem solving, important at every level. And that's a systemic challenge that I think all these stakeholders have to address. Then there's this sort of moments of brilliance and provocation and radical creativity that occur seldom and once in a while by unique individuals in unique circumstances and their unique conditions, with working with collaborators who are of certain expertise. And it's just the right moment, the right time, the right place, with the right money, the right sauce. And then something amazing happens. But that's very infrequent. So there's both systemic challenges, and then there are these challenges that have to do with how do we foster those moments of radical creativity and brilliance that drive and change the world in deep and provocative ways.
Yeah, that's great. This is such a great point. And I'm interested in the difference between what's happening in the US and how we value things, and the idea of, the arts here, and then the idea of the arts in Europe. And I'm wondering, especially Clara and everyone, to speak a little bit more to this difference and kind of what are the possible maybe lessons we could learn. I mean, especially in the US, let's just say, but
I will just chime in as the only European on the panel. I think clearly that's a fascinating question that we ask ourselves also in what are the lessons learned from both sides of the Atlantic? And therein lies also the answer. Clearly, there must be a knowledge exchange. So there's lots that both the sides can contribute, and that we always want to emulate when we see something on the other side that we appreciate. So when it comes to the art ecosystem, I think it's clear to say that Europe has heavily invested over decades in a solid funding infrastructure for the arts. So art and culture have been a public good in the European mindset. And clearly, I'm Austrian, and I can only say as an artist myself, that then transitioned to academia, but I've been an artist for 15 years, and well, it is a pretty good life. So yeah, that's incredible. And there's clearly a willingness to support bold ideas, to experiment, and to invest in them as a public good without this notion of return on investment and so certain KPIs or to have to fulfill certain metrics of success. But that's an inherently, that's part of the DNA of every artistic process. The moment you try to anticipate the outcome, you've already lost the game. You lost the ball game. This is not what it's about. It's not. I don't want to speak in platitudes, but clearly it's not about the destination, but about the process and the journey. And so we've been blessed with a very solid funding ecosystem. But now the interesting part is, what can we learn from a disruptive sphere like Silicon Valley, and what can it contribute? Why is Silicon Valley now the modern day Florence and not other parts of the world? Mm-hmm. So there's clearly a lot to learn from whatever is done in Silicon Valley. And this is also clearly what we've done to map out through these reports, for better or worse, and try really identify how we can contribute, how we can learn from each other, what can be translated in other ecosystems and what simply can't, due to cultural context, due to history, which can be, important, but also baggage depending on how you want to view it. And so there's many factors, and it's a complex interplay. And as Joel has also pointed out, it's not just one stakeholder with one agenda. It's even in one silo, there's a variety of actors with different agendas and different mindsets. So you can't just simplify this to one formula. So this is what innovation equals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, every artist and organization I talked to in the context of the report longed for a European funding ecosystem. I mean, I don't actually know what the reality of that is. So I don't know if they do as well, but it's certainly romanticized, here as being kind of, gold standard, and that there's more sustainability for this kind of work. I have not been an artist in the US, I'm sorry, in Europe, so I simply don't know, but that seems to be a really, it's like, maybe it's a mirage, who knows, but it's something that people really value. What's interesting? So, I mean, what's interesting, I mean, I talk to people from different kinds of funding bodies, and it's not very coherent. There's a National Endowment for the Arts, the state governing agencies. I forget what some of the California has per capita. I mean, they have a massive budget for the California Arts Council, but per capita, it's not like even in the top 10 because there's so many people here. What I think is interesting for this particular conversation is where art and technology practice, and I agree with you, Joel, that it's kind of this slippery, problematic term. What does that even mean? That's something that I kept coming into. It's a placeholder for a whole slew of disciplines and fields, and it's very much in the making. But what is interesting about it in Silicon Valley is that everybody I talked to here thought, okay, well, because there's this technology element to the art, tech companies are dying to come to the table. And yes and no. It seems like, I mean, Joel, as Joel can attest, there have been some moments of that, and you've been a critical part of that. But one of the big examples that people like to talk about is the Bay Lights project, right? The large installation of lights on the Bay Bridge. And it was supposed to be this monument technology, the largest light art project ever. I spoke to the primary fundraiser for the project. She's like, they didn't come. The tech companies did not come, you know? There were a few people from the tech industry, like Marissa Mayer and the Zynga boys, she called them. But mostly it was kind of the old guard kind of art philanthropists. And so this art and technology loosely defined kind of practice is in this really marginal space here. So what is its value? Is it kind of defined vis-a-vis traditional arts and how we understand contributions to humanity? Is it about its value proposition to technological development? I mean, this is the thing that I think is kind of a constantly shifting thing. I mean, Joel, in our conversation, you mentioned that there's this kind of value appended to creativity, but people are creative in Silicon Valley. It's not like they're not.
Right.
They're doing creative work. So why is the arts different there?
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to tackle. Well, first off, let me say that I think that you know, this distinction between international and this regional, you know, arena of the Bay Area that we play in, it's like no other. Money means something entirely different here than it means anywhere else in the world, I think. It really is based around this return on investment framework. And that distinguishes it also, I think, you know, nationally in terms of its positioning. So the art support here in the Bay Area is pretty strange. About 98% of philanthropy leaves the Bay Area. Philanthropic dollars leaves the Bay Area. 98%. Think about everything that functions off that remaining 2 or 3%. That yeah, and the competition for those dollars. Yeah. So I mean, there are the tradition of funding here is around philanthropy. It's just in terms of, you think about the tech industry. You know, why do they give money? And you know, they give it because it's part of the corporate social responsibility framework in some way. It's part of individual leadership within a company where it's kind of philanthropic, sort of. You know, individuals using the money of the company to kind of invest in a particular program or area or artist, or it's coming from maybe a more institutionalized, you know, framework in terms of, you know, embedding a research arena with the mentality of an artist who might somehow shake things up. I mean, those are all kind of valuable, but that's what needs to be disrupted and destroyed. You know, that whole framing of how the money works is really, really problematic for the arts. And I don't see any emergence. This is the battle that's been going on for 40 years since I set foot in this place called Silicon Valley. It has not changed one iota. And until I think that becomes disrupted, until the systemic change that needs to occur, both in the arts, but also in industry, we're not really going to see the kind of prospering that I think is alluded to here in this conversation, where that kind of dedication to the cultural welfare of the community and the region and the nation and the global state of things is part and parcel of every decision that gets made at every level. So there's a whole lot of work still to be done to crack the nut here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I was looking at, I think the study that I imagine, Joel, you got that stat from the Giving Code, which was a study done in 2016 about the nature of Silicon Valley philanthropy. And it identified ROI and impact and this model of effective altruism as a way that people want to see their dollars working. So how do you fit the arts into that? Do they, I don't know, how do you measure the impact of an artwork? Is it 100 views in 5 days? Is it how it changes your soul 30%? How do you do that? So what's interesting, some of the foundation leaders I talked to is that people have been bending over backwards to try and define that ROI. You know, there's been this like some nonprofits have done like Shark Tank style events to pitch to potential investors the value of their projects. Is that where we want to go? This is what I mean by like kind of contouring to the desires and the sort of structure of tech and capital. Or do we need complete and total disruption, Joel, like you described? I don't know how to get there, but I would like to see that as well.
Well,
Sarah,
I don't know how to get there either.
Sorry. Go ahead, Joel.
I was just going to add, I mean, one of the things at 01 that we were committed, at least during my leadership there, that we were committed to was, in order for Silicon Valley to better understand itself, we have to bring the outside world in. It's the best way to look at oneself is to have someone else look at you.
Here we are.
Exactly. Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely the what was necessary, because looking at your own navel doesn't really help. And so we really are committed to ensuring that by bringing international artists and everything that comes with those relationships, in terms of the networks, in terms of the resources, in terms of the associations, collaborations, both institutional and industry and cultural, to have that sort of feeding the base, if you will, while simultaneously elevating the positioning of the artists who are more regional or national within that context. It really helped everyone better understand themselves, and by enabling the questions to be asked that needed to be asked is what is this thing, Silicon Valley, and how as artists do we engage and interact with it, and then to be able to demonstrate that and evidence it and show it experientially makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So open up the gates, open up the floodgates, because clearly there are lessons to be learned. It goes both ways, absolutely. But so the question that I always keep circling back to is that notion that it must be the tech industry who gives the dollars for the arts. That is like an inherent, like a very different mindset than other innovation ecosystems around the world would ever have, right? They wouldn't turn to the private sector in search for funds for an art project because, or just partially, because the notion is those are businesses and they have business interests at heart. And so why do those dollars flock to a hospital or an NGO in Africa? Because there's more visibility, and that altruism is clearly converted into something much more tangible, so to speak. And Taylor, we're here in a safe space, and you know what I mean by that. But so art is a risky investment unless you buy a Picasso and hang it in your house. And this notion of what is the inherent value for the arts, that's not something that you can't transplant into an ecosystem that was built on almost a Darwinistic, profit-driven mindset. And so this inherent incompatibility can only be cracked once we really start circling back in history and coming to the point. So this is culture. So this is Silicon Valley is the last step of a cultural evolution, where the money is in the private sector. And the question that I keep coming back to is art a public good in the US? Is it something that the US wants to invest in? Because clearly those are the brightest minds. This is where the innovation actually happens. It will then trickle down into the private sector, eventually even perhaps become product. So this is something that you can't just try to solve in Silicon Valley. And I always feel like it's a bit of a stretch to go that far to attack the tech industry for it or for their lack of commitment towards the arts, because they're running a business and it's not their job to invest in this.
Sure, but it's larger structural issues. Like, why do they have all these resources? Why aren't they getting taxed? Why is Elon Musk not paying any tax? Why?
You can do, there's lots of things where you can,
Yeah.
Exactly. Those are the structural problems that you have to circle back and see from its perspective to understand this complex systemic deficiency.
Yes. Well, this is great. This is such a fascinating conversation, and I think one that really needs to be had. And I love what's going on in Silicon Valley and the work that the grid's doing, and to even be posing these questions and researching a way to sort of rethink things and restructure things, and like not the navel gazing, like Joel said. It's sort of broadening and having someone come in and give their perspective. And this ties into really well into the questions and answers section, because we, believe it or not, are almost out of time. Time flies when you're having fun. So this is actually a great question that dovetails really well into what we were just talking about. But can the grid influence policy to create a larger funding model for the art and tech that mirrors what the EU has done with STARTS or the Horizon funding?
Oh yeah, we'll certainly try. I have a feeling I know who that was. Yes, it's incredible, an incredible endeavor, and one of those examples that will really go a long way. Interdisciplinary approaches. It stands for science, technology, and the arts. There's lots of approaches like that, also in the US. But clearly, this is public money that the EU put in a budget and just allocates it to projects that are pioneering. And so we're trying to do that. The grid is art, tech, and policy, and we're all diplomats who work in exactly that space to try to mitigate how to create perhaps a healthy relationship between these different stakeholders that haven't thought to think about arts, haven't thought about including artists in their processes, have perhaps more of a tunnel vision. And this is where we see a real niche and a necessity to mitigate. So this is not just another thing that pops up and disappears in 2 years. We're here to stay, and we're rapidly growing our network. Every month we have new members. So I just want to say, join us, because it's not only for institutions, it's also for individuals. So get on the grid. Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Does that, Joel or Vanessa, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm not a policymaker or a diplomat, but I do hope that kind of policy can be leveraged. I mean, there is the angle that art and technology can influence tech policy, but I do think, as I've mentioned, in order to actually create a system that supports that kind of innovation, artists have to be supported. So we do need that, and I hope that we can move towards that.
Yes.
Finding the means to turn the spigot on for public resource funds to support the arts is the paramount challenge of this next century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Okay, we have one more question, unless others want to add. If anyone else wants to add a question, please feel free. So we have one more as of now, and it is, how can the European mindset of supporting cultural institutions be created in the US? So it's similar to less, but on average, even a small institution in the EU will see tens of thousands of visitors a month. This is much less than the US. So
I think I saw this diagram the other day that was looking at how different people in different countries spend their leisure time, their sleep time, their work time. And there's a real addiction to work in this country that doesn't lead to spending time on yourself and on kind of cultural betterment. So I think we really need to address that we deserve culture that we deserve to be able to go to museums. And maybe that is an artistic project.
Yeah.
There's not really that much to add because we already tackled that question a little earlier, but clearly there's an argument to be made that an appreciation for the arts also as leisure and as a betterment for the soul, or just for oneself, is part of education. So if that is a value that you want to pass on to your kids and they develop an appreciation for it, I mean, I have to say there are several factors that come into play here. So most of the museum infrastructure in Europe is free or very, very cheap. I mean, I go to the Viennese State Opera, which is the best one in the world, for €0. And so this happens, right? So culture, since I was a kid, was always free, and it's not just culture as in entertainment, but really to actually go see heavy stuff, and that forms a person, and therefore when you're an adult you create an appreciation for it, and that makes you want to support it and maintain that ecosystem. And so there's just one always says I mean, I have to say Americans are addicted to work because it's inherently intertwined with our identity. And you often hear that Europeans work differently in the sense that a job is a job. But statistically, it's actually not so true, because Europeans always also work very hard. It's just just a little bit of a narrative, like a storytelling of a cultural myth that has been perpetuated since American exceptionalism, et cetera, and Europe is more of a Disneyland for tourists where you just relax and lay back.
It's not.
Those narratives are counterintuitive because in real numbers they don't hold up. But it's certainly true that there's lots of work to be done to just emphasize that the arts is an inherent part of our human experience that nurtures us as an individual, and it needs to be supported.
And I think I'd add to that there are no systems to support people who don't work here. Health insurance is tethered to work as well. So it's necessary in a way that maybe it's not as necessary. I mean, you have to work in Europe, obviously, but it's kind of fundamental to existence.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Great. All right. Well, that was our last question. And Joel, do you have any last parting words on this? Any thoughts, or should we?
I just want
no pressure.
I just want to applaud all of you in the grid for furthering the discourse on this subject, and I think it's so important, and I wish you the best of luck and offer my support in whatever way that I can. So yeah, thank you for including me.
Of course. Great. Well, that is all the time that we have for the webinar today. Please look for the follow-up email that we'll send, and that will let everyone know when the video conference, we recorded this, so it'll be online, so you can share it and you can reference it, or however. So just keep a lookout for that, and then also keep a lookout for an email from the Goethe and the Grid about programming for next year, 2021, via the websites and social media pages. And on behalf of Vanessa, Joel, and Clara, as well as the team at the Goethe Institute, and of course the Grid, thank you for joining us and taking the time to participate in the discussion. My name is Marnie Benny, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Can I just add one last thought, if I may? We're going to send out an email with the Grid's Art and Tech report by Vanessa Chang right after this.
Yay.
That'll be the official publication of the report, which is going to be circulated around the world. We're sending it to the European Commission in Brussels on Monday morning. So heads up, because it is an exceptional piece of investigative journalism. Incredibly.
Yes, it's amazing.
We're very, very proud of her. So thank you so much, Vanessa.
Welcome. It's my pleasure.